Under a sky full of carnival lights and the slow-turning shadow of a Ferris wheel, a 17-year-old hometown hero steps away for a minute that stretches into decades. A girlfriend waits with rising dread as the clock slips past 9:43 p.m. A final announcement echoes over dusty pathways while a pickup truck sits untouched, and a community's certainty begins to crack. Tracks fade at the edge of Highway 34. A weathered ride operator and a fleeting conversation behind the livestock barn will later trouble every memory. And years from now, when the soil gives up a twisted bicycle, the first true answer will finally surface. This is the night Millfield learns how quickly safety can shatter. This is where everything begins. What happened in the 32 minutes between "I will be right back" and the fair's closing call? And who stood with Marcus in those shadows behind the barn? Why did the trail die at the highway as if the town itself refused to say more? And what hidden thing would wait beneath the fairgrounds for more than 2 decades? If you want to follow these questions to their end, like this video, subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story. Let us reach 5,000 likes so we can keep uncovering what small towns hide in plain sight. The Millfield County Fair was winding down beneath a September sky that looked endless, the air heavy with kettle corn sweetness and the thrum of diesel generators that kept the midway alive. The Ferris wheel creaked in steady rhythm, its colored bulbs painting brief ribbons of light across faces and dust, while the carousel's calliope drifted in and out like a memory. Families drifted toward the parking lot with half-eaten candy apples and deflated balloons, their voices softening as the ride slowed. It felt like the kind of night that lingers warm and easy, the kind of night people keep. Marcus Thompson moved through that glow in his red and white leather jacket, tall and calm, the quarterback everyone knew by stride alone. He squeezed Sarah, Walsh's hand, palm still damp from the tilt-a-whirl, and promised he would find Coach Martinez about the practice schedule. He checked his watch. It read 9:43 p.m. He nodded once, then slipped into the thinning crowd, shoulders cutting a path past game booths and stacked prize bears. A few steps, then a dozen. Then he was gone beyond the light wash of the Ferris wheel. A small pause settled over Sarah, the kind that feels harmless for the first minute and begins to tighten at the third. By the time the loudspeakers crackled with the final thank you at 10:15, the midway had emptied to sweepers and tired carnies, and Sarah was standing on her tiptoes asking the Ferris wheel operator if he had seen the tall kid in the red and white jacket. The ride operator shook his head with the weary patience of someone who has watched 1,000 nights end. Another pause. Longer now. She crossed the dirt lanes toward the livestock barn, toward the arcade lights dimming to dull neon, toward the open field that was already turning back into a farm. The air felt cooler. The crowd was gone. The space where Marcus should have been remained stubbornly blank. At 10:30, the fairgrounds looked like a stage after the curtain falls. Jake Morrison and his father were loading their Holstein, calling ice tonight. Jake had not seen Marcus since earlier when they tried and failed to bring down milk bottles for more than a plastic comb. The Thompsons' 1995 Ford pickup sat right where Marcus had left it, patient and ordinary. His wallet and license lay undisturbed on the dashboard, where he always left them. His keys were with him. The familiar truck made the absence feel sharper, as if the vehicle had stayed to hold the space he should have filled. Sheriff Patricia Keller reached the field by midnight, the last carnival truck easing onto Highway 34 while the wind tugged at the grass. She had handled bar fights and fence disputes on these roads, but something in her gut marked this night different. She called the state patrol. She marked off the quiet lanes with her flashlight. She looked back at the Ferris wheel's vacant circle and felt the shape of the problem form in the dark. A dependable boy, a devoted girlfriend, a walk of a few hundred yards and then nothing. The simplest path had become a blank line. The highway's black ribbon shone under the stars like a door half open. Millfield itself pressed close around. The fairgrounds, a 2-mile town with a grain elevator at one end and a Casey's General Store at the other, homes branching off like ribs from Highway 34. People knew each other here. Attendance at a Friday football game could outnumber a meeting at the courthouse. Marcus's name had appeared in the Millfield Gazette so often that it felt like a part of the masthead. He was the boy in the yearbook whose picture everyone recognized, the quarterback who moved like a fact, the steady son of Robert and Diana Thompson who never left a promise half kept. On this night, that certainty made the silence feel wrong, in a way that settled into everyone's bones. Sarah waited by the Ferris wheel as long as waiting felt reasonable, then longer, then past the point where the body stops pretending it is calm. The bulbs flickered once and went dark. The generator finally coughed into quiet. The field exhaled. The night held itself still, as if the land itself were listening for footsteps that did not return. And somewhere between the last ride shutting down and the town locking its doors, the story that Millfield would tell for the next 26 years took its first full breath. The fairgrounds began to quiet after the final announcement rolled through the loudspeakers at 10:15. Families were already halfway to their cars, carnival lights dimmed one by one, and the last music from the carousel faded into the open Nebraska night. Sarah Walsh stood still near the Ferris wheel, her eyes searching the thinning crowd, expecting, at any moment, to see Marcus's tall frame cutting back toward her with that familiar easy smile. Each second felt heavier than the last, the promise of a quick return now stretching thin. Dale Hoffman, the Ferris wheel operator with 30 years of carnival nights behind him, remembered the girl stepping close and asking if he had seen the boy in the red and white jacket. He shook his head with a tired certainty. He had watched faces circle all night long, but he had not seen Marcus return. Sarah's heart sank as she turned back toward the midway, now nearly empty, her voice catching as she called his name into the wide and echoing space. By 10:30, the carnival was little more than shadows of its earlier self. Booths were shuttered, lights switched off, and workers swept popcorn from the dirt lanes. Sarah found Jake Morrison near the livestock trailers, helping his father load their Holstein. Jake looked surprised at her question and explained that he had not seen Marcus since earlier in the evening when the two of them had laughed at their own failed attempts to win anything more valuable than a plastic comb. The easy joy of that memory now felt painfully distant. The Thompsons' pickup truck remained parked where Marcus had left it 6 hours earlier, ordinary and patient under the lot lights. His wallet sat on the dashboard with $43, and his driver's license untouched, just as he always kept it. His keys were still in his pocket when he walked away from Sarah. The truck's quiet presence felt wrong, like a reminder that the owner had vanished without taking even the most basic necessities with him. A clock ticked past the half hour. The fair dissolved into silence, and Sarah's fear became impossible to push down. A simple promise to return had turned into a question that hung over an empty field. The sheriff who would arrive before midnight already knew this was not a boy running off, but something far more dangerous. By midnight, the last carnival truck had rolled out onto Highway 34, its taillights disappearing into the dark horizon. The fairgrounds were silent now, only scraps of paper blowing across the dirt lanes. Sheriff Patricia Keller pulled her cruiser into the empty field, headlights sweeping over shuttered booths and half-dismantled rides. She was 42 years old, a veteran of this county, more familiar with cattle thefts and bar fights than missing teenagers. Yet the moment she stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a weight in her chest. This was not a case of a boy sneaking away for a few hours of freedom. Something here was wrong. Keller radioed the Nebraska State Patrol and alerted surrounding counties, her voice steady, but carrying the edge of urgency. Within minutes, she had patrol cars canvassing back roads, farm lanes, and intersections that led out of Millfield. She marked the pickup truck in the lot, untouched and waiting, and wrote it down in her field notes. She listened to Sarah Walsh's trembling voice describe the last moments at the Ferris wheel. The words, "I will be right," back-cutting deeper each time Sarah repeated them. Everyone who knew Marcus Thompson said the same thing. He was steady. He was dependable. He was the kind of boy who would never leave a girlfriend waiting or a family worrying. Sheriff Keller had watched him play football under Friday night lights, had seen him carry himself like a young man already, older than his years. He was a homecoming king, a scholarship athlete, but more than that, he was trusted. The kind of boy who returned when he said he would. That was why his disappearance felt different. It did not fit the usual pattern, the careless wandering of a restless teenager. It had the sharp edge of something darker, something unexpected. Keller stood with her flashlight sweeping across the abandoned midway, the silence pressing close, the wide Nebraska sky stretching endless above her. The image of Marcus walking away into this night would not leave her mind. She knew this case would not be solved by waiting for him to come back on his own. The search for Marcus Thompson had just begun, and the weight of it would soon pull the entire town into its grip. Millfield, Nebraska was the kind of place where the rhythm of life moved with the seasons and the hum of farm equipment. A 2-mile stretch along Highway 34 held the heart of the town, with grain elevators rising on the east end and a Casey's General Store anchoring the west. Church steeples pierced the skyline, and tree-lined streets branched off like ribs from the highway. It was a place where football games filled the stands more than town meetings, where the Gazette printed more about Friday night touchdowns than city council decisions, and where every stranger's face was noticed immediately. Safety was a given here, or at least it had always felt that way. Marcus Thompson had been born into this rhythm. His father, Robert, delivered farm equipment parts, known by nearly every farmer in 3 counties. His mother, Diana, worked as a secretary at the elementary school, the kind of woman who remembered every child's name and made sure every holiday program ran smoothly. Together they built a life of faith and routine, attending First Methodist Church each Sunday and leading volunteer drives for those in need. Neighbors called them good people, the kind who showed up when something had to be done. Marcus inherited that steadiness, but he carried it with a rare brightness. At 6'3", with piercing blue eyes, he looked built for the football field, but he never used his size to intimidate. Teachers described him as polite, competitive without cruelty, and always willing to help others. As quarterback for the Millfield Eagles, he had led the team to their first state championship appearance in 23 years. College scouts circled early, drawn by the mix of natural ability and relentless work ethic. By September of 1998, Marcus had already committed to the University of Nebraska on a full scholarship. For most small towns, having one of their own step into that kind of spotlight was a story that would be told for generations. Yet what set Marcus apart was not the headlines. It was the quiet acts no newspaper wrote about. He tutored classmates, struggling in algebra, carried extra quarters for younger kids at the arcade, and never passed a neighbor in need without stopping to lend a hand. He raked leaves for elderly families in the fall and shoveled snow in the winter, not because he was asked, but because he noticed. Sarah Walsh had fallen in love with him for those reasons. She was drawn not to his trophies or the newspaper clippings, but to the way he remembered her grandmother's birthday, the way he made space for everyone around him. They had been together for 2 years, and their plans stretched well beyond high school. Marcus wanted to study agricultural business, hoping to return and take over Pete Henderson's farm supply operation. Sarah dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. They pictured a life built in Millfield, marrying in the same church where they had been confirmed, raising children under the same wide Nebraska skies. The town saw in Marcus a reflection of their best hopes, the belief that dedication and kindness could carry someone from Friday night lights to a bright future. That was why his sudden disappearance did not just unsettle Millfield. It broke something in the very identity of the community. The last ordinary week of his life would soon reveal how much weight he was quietly carrying. The week before the fair carried with it the busy weight of senior year, but for Marcus Thompson, it also brought the kind of attention most teenagers only dream of. On Tuesday evening, he sat in the office of the Millfield Gazette, patiently answering the same questions from reporters about his college commitment and the Eagles' chances at another state championship. The small room smelled of ink and newsprint, and the editor scribbled notes as Marcus spoke with his steady calm. He was polite, careful, and far more grounded than the excitement around him. By Wednesday, the attention had grown larger. An assistant coach from the University of Nebraska sat in the Thompson living room, sipping Diana's coffee while explaining academic requirements and team expectations. Robert listened with pride, nodding as his son asked thoughtful questions. For most families in Millfield, the presence of a college recruiter would have been overwhelming, but Marcus treated it as part of the process. He knew the scholarship was an opportunity, but he also knew that football was not the only measure of a life. Through it all, he kept his routines. He continued working part-time at Henderson's Farm Supply, stacking heavy feed bags, repairing equipment, and listening to Pete Henderson's lessons on diesel engines. Pete had known the Thompson family for 3 generations, and in Marcus he saw a young man who could carry both strength and thoughtfulness. That Friday, as Marcus wiped sweat from his brow, he had seemed unusually reflective. He told Pete he was trying to figure out what really mattered. Pete asked if the pressure was getting to him, but Marcus only smiled, saying that sometimes it was hard to tell which path you were meant to follow. Saturday brought the tradition he and Sarah never missed, the county fair. They had been going together for 2 years, walking the same dusty paths, riding the same spinning rides, laughing at the same games. It was not just an evening of fun. It was their small ritual of belonging, a promise that their lives, even as they reached outward, would always circle back to each other. They spoke easily of the future that night. Marcus would major in agricultural business and return home to build a life here. Sarah would attend veterinary school and continue her calling to care for animals. They pictured marriage in the same church that anchored their town and children running under the same oak trees that had shaded them. On that warm September evening, with the Ferris wheel turning slowly against the sky, their dreams felt solid. Their plans seemed certain, yet within hours those plans would collapse into silence, leaving only questions behind. The first light of dawn would not bring Marcus home, but instead awaken a search that would consume everyone who loved him. The key. First light of Sunday morning stretched across the empty fairgrounds, painting long shadows over Peterson's cornfield that had only hours before held laughter, music, and the glow of carnival rides. Sheriff Patricia Keller had turned the Peterson farmhouse into a makeshift command post. The kitchen table, once a place for family meals, now held maps of the county, radios crackling with updates, and cups of coffee that went cold faster than anyone could drink them. Robert and Diana Thompson sat close together, their faces drained of color, clinging to the yearbook photo they had carried in with trembling hands. The boy in that picture, smiling and steady, was the same boy now gone without a trace. Word spread quickly through Millfield, traveling from church congregations to coffee shops and across the early morning radio. By 7:30, volunteers were arriving in waves drawn as if by magnet. Farmers came in boots still caked with mud from morning chores. Churchwomen brought thermoses of coffee and sandwiches wrapped in foil. Teenagers who had graduated years earlier returned to help search for the boy they remembered under Friday night lights. The fairgrounds, silent only hours before, filled again, this time with determination instead of celebration. At 9 o'clock, the sound of barking announced the arrival of search dogs from Lincoln. German shepherds trained in both tracking and cadaver detection padded through Marcus's bedroom first, circling and sniffing to capture his scent. Handler Jim Crawford, his weathered hands steady from 20 years of experience, led them to the Ferris wheel where Marcus had last been. Seen. Noses pressed to the ground, the dogs began to pull forward, following an invisible path. Step after step they moved with certainty, leading east toward Highway 34. Then, abruptly, the trail ended. At the edge of the asphalt, the dogs circled, in confusion, whining as if the scent had been swallowed by the black ribbon of road. Crawford explained softly to Keller that vehicle exhaust, wind, or the simple passage of time could erase a trail. It was as if Marcus had stepped onto the highway and vanished into the dark. Search teams fanned out in wide grids across farmland that stretched to the horizon. Men and women walked shoulder to shoulder through cornfields, their voices calling Marcus's name until the echo of it seemed to hang in the air itself. They peered into irrigation ditches, searched abandoned barns, and waded through stock ponds. Every shed, every silo, every stretch of pasture within 5 miles was combed. Meanwhile, the state patrol set up roadblocks on the highways. Drivers were stopped and shown Marcus's photo, asked if they had seen anything unusual on Saturday night. Local radio stations broadcast his description every hour. By noon, a television crew from Omaha had arrived, their satellite truck parked against the backdrop of endless sky, making the case suddenly feel larger than Millfield itself. At the command post, Sarah Walsh sat silent at the farmhouse kitchen table, folding and refolding a piece of paper with trembling fingers. She had not left since dawn. Her eyes were fixed on the phone, willing it to ring with news that Marcus was safe. Each time a search team returned empty-handed, she seemed to lose a little more light in her face. The boy who promised her "I will be right back" had vanished into a silence that no one could break. And just as hope began to stretch thin, a man from the community stepped forward with a story that made everyone stop and listen. By Sunday afternoon, the air inside the Peterson farmhouse command post felt heavy, thick with the weight of unanswered questions. Then came a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for reliability. Earl Mitchell, a retired railroad worker, stepped forward. He told Sheriff Keller that around 10:30 on Saturday night, just as he was driving home from visiting his sister, his headlights had caught the shape of a young man walking along Highway 34, tall, athletic build, wearing what looked like a light-colored jacket. Earl was certain it could have been Marcus. The timing fit. The direction fit. For a brief moment, it felt like a thread that might finally pull the search toward an answer. Patrol cars rushed to canvass the area. Neighbors within a 5-mile radius were questioned, and deputies combed the roadside ditches and fields. But the details began to slip. Earl's wife quietly mentioned he had been drinking at his sister's home that evening. His night vision was not sharp anymore. Under more questions, his memory softened. Maybe the jacket had been darker. Maybe the boy was shorter than he first thought. The lead that had lifted everyone's hopes began to crumble. What had felt like clarity now looked like little more than a shadow on the road. 2 days later, another witness came forward. Doris Hansen, who ran the food concession near the livestock barn, told investigators she remembered seeing Marcus around 9 o'clock. But he had not been alone. Doris recalled him speaking with another figure hidden partly in the shadows behind the barn. She said the exchange had looked tense, voices raised enough to catch her attention even through the noise of the carnival. It had struck her as unusual because Marcus was not the type to argue publicly. She had only seen a glimpse, but it stayed with her when she heard he was missing. Investigators pressed for details. Was the person a man or woman? Tall or short? What clothing? Doris could not say. The barn had been poorly lit and she had been busy serving corn dogs and funnel cakes. All she could hold on to was the impression of Marcus upset, his voice sharp in a way that was out of character. That memory unsettled everyone who heard it. If Marcus had been in a confrontation that night, who was the other person? Sheriff Keller and her team dug into every angle they could think of. They questioned teammates looking for jealousies or rivalries. They spoke with former girlfriends, searching for threads of romantic conflict. They pressed Sarah for details of their relationship, searching for cracks or secrets, but nothing held. Marcus's teammates described him as respected. Old girlfriends only had kind words. Sarah's story never shifted. Their relationship had been steady, their plans for the future unshaken, their last words perfectly ordinary. The more they pulled, the more it seemed Marcus had no enemies, no reason to leave, no obvious threat. A boy with every reason to look forward to tomorrow had walked into the night and disappeared as though the earth itself had swallowed him. As the days passed, the desperate search began to fill with false leads and flickers of hope that would not last. The weeks that followed turned into a blur of hope rising and collapsing. Every phone call, every tip, every whisper of a sighting felt like it could be the moment the mystery broke open. A truck driver swore he had seen Marcus at a rest stop near Grand Island, but security footage revealed another boy altogether. A convenience store clerk in North Platte claimed Marcus had bought gasoline the following morning, until the receipt showed the timestamp did not match. A runaway girl in Omaha thought she had met him in a shelter, but her description faltered on the simplest details. Wrong height, wrong voice, wrong eyes. Each lead began with sharp excitement, then dissolved into another dead end. The most painful, misidentification came close to home. One evening, Diana Thompson drove to Henderson's Farm Supply to post a missing flyer. In the fading light, she spotted a tall figure in a leather jacket walking between the buildings. Her heart surged. Her voice cracked as she called Marcus's name, and she began to run. But when the boy turned, it was Jake Morrison, wearing his own football jacket. The look on Diana's face as hope drained away would stay with Jake for the rest of his life. As autumn deepened into winter, the energy of the search began to slow. Snow arrived early, covering the fairgrounds and fields in white silence. The Nebraska State Patrol had poured its resources into the case, but by February they stepped back, handing the investigation fully to Sheriff Keller. The FBI's involvement had lasted only 11 days, long enough to decide that no evidence pointed to an interstate crime. With no ransom note, no body, no vehicle, and no digital trail, federal agents concluded Marcus had simply vanished into thin air. Back in Millfield, Sheriff Keller sat in her office, staring at cardboard boxes filled with reports, photographs, and scattered pieces of evidence. Cigarette butts that meant nothing, a torn concert ticket with no connection, witness statements that contradicted one another until nothing felt solid. The files stacked higher, but no new truth emerged. Each folder was like another stone on the weight already pressing down on the town. Marcus's disappearance, once an urgent search pulsing through every street and every field, was slowly settling under the frost of uncertainty. Hope had not died, but it was fading into silence, leaving behind a cold question that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The toll of that silence would soon begin to show most sharply in the people closest to Marcus. Grief does not move in straight lines, and in the Thompson household it began to take two different shapes. Robert threw himself into the search, using his savings for gasoline, photocopies, and volunteer efforts. He spent nights sitting in Marcus's bedroom, holding the football helmet that would never again take the field, staring at recruitment letters pinned to the bulletin board. His shoulders bent over time as if the weight of unanswered questions pressed harder each year. Diana carried her grief differently. Every evening at 9:43, the exact moment Marcus had walked away, she drove to Peterson Field. She parked where the Ferris wheel had once stood and sat for 32 minutes, the length of time between his last words to Sarah and the final announcement of the fair. She never missed this vigil, as if holding still in that space might undo time itself. Friends worried, but it became her ritual, her way of keeping Marcus present in a world that refused to give him back. The strain of these separate paths began to erode their marriage. Robert pushed for private investigators they could not afford. Diana turned toward psychics and mediums who promised answers Robert could not believe. Neither could comfort the other, because both were drowning in grief expressed differently. Slowly, the home that once rang with football talk and laughter grew quiet, filled only with rituals of sorrow. Sarah Walsh, the girl who had waited by the Ferris wheel, made the most painful choice of all. She accepted a scholarship to Iowa State University, a decision she had once planned to turn down to stay near Marcus. She carried his final words like an echo that haunted her dreams. "I will be right back" became a phrase she could never escape. Leaving Millfield felt like betrayal, but staying felt like drowning. For Sheriff Patricia Keller, the case became a shadow that followed her everywhere. By 2000, after years of dead ends and unanswered questions, she requested early retirement, 6 years before she had planned to step down. The weight of failure pressed too heavily, and her reputation dimmed at meetings with other law enforcement officials. The case boxes, once her responsibility, now passed to her deputy Tom Bradley. He focused on the day-to-day crimes he could solve while Marcus's files began to gather dust, eventually digitized but never advanced. Meanwhile, Millfield itself changed. Henderson's farm supply where Marcus had worked closed when Pete Henderson retired. A Dollar General filled the space, a store for essentials but not for stories. The reward fund, started by the Methodist Church, slowly grew from $12,000 to nearly $50,000, fueled by donations and interest. But the money only served as a reminder that no one had claimed it. No one had broken the silence. The town carried on, as small towns do. But Marcus's name never left the air. His absence was a wound everyone carried, even as years slipped. By then, after more than 2 decades, a twist of timing and chance unearthed something hidden beneath the very ground where the fair once stood. For 26 years, the Peterson Field returned each September to the rhythm of carnival rides and funnel cakes, even as older residents could not help but glance at the space where Marcus Thompson had last been seen. By the summer of 2024, plans were underway to expand the fairgrounds with a new concrete pad for food vendors. It was meant to be a modest improvement, a sign that the town still believed in its traditions. No one expected the ground itself to hold the first true clue in decades. The confrontation escalated quickly. Hoffman, unsteady from alcohol, grabbed Marcus by the arm and began dragging him toward what he called a security trailer. Marcus resisted, pulling back, not understanding why a stranger was handling him like a criminal. In the struggle, his head struck the metal steps of the trailer with a sickening thud. Brennan said the sound had haunted his dreams for decades. Marcus collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. Panic overtook both men. Marcus was still breathing, Brennan insisted, but dazed and motionless. Instead of calling for help, Hoffman shouted that they had to move him. They carried Marcus to Hoffman's pickup truck, loaded him inside, and drove out of town to an abandoned grain silo. Brennan's voice shook when he admitted they left him there. He said Hoffman insisted on burial, using carnival shovels to cover Marcus beneath the dirt. Before dawn, they returned to the fairgrounds. Hoffman smashed Brennan's bicycle with a wrench until the frame bent beyond repair, then ordered him to bury it behind the rides. He told Brennan that if anyone asked, they knew nothing. And for 26 years, Brennan obeyed, carrying the weight of silence as the town searched endlessly for a boy who had never left. As Brennan spoke, Morrison felt both rage and sorrow rising together. The truth was finally spilling out, but it was not born of evil plans. It was born of fear, recklessness, and 2 men who chose their freedom over a teenager's life. What investigators uncovered next would finally confirm if Brennan's confession was true or only another story added to the long silence. Timothy Brennan's confession painted a picture of 2 men, one reckless and drunk, the other young and terrified, stumbling into a decision that changed an entire town. But Brennan's words alone could not be enough. Investigators needed proof. Dale Hoffman, the Ferris wheel operator at the center of the story, had died of liver failure in 2009, buried in a pauper's grave outside Amarillo, Texas. That meant every detail of what happened in Millfield in 1998 now rested on Brennan's account. Sheriff Kyle Morrison and his team turned their focus to the abandoned grain silo Brennan had described. It had been demolished in 2003 to make way for a wind farm, but the ground still carried memory. Ground-penetrating radar swept across the soil revealed unnatural disturbances beneath the surface, faint signatures of digging long ago. With slow precision, investigators began excavation, working carefully as if peeling back layers of silence. On the 3rd day, fragments of denim were uncovered, weathered but still clinging to shape. The material matched the clothing Marcus had been wearing the night he vanished. Then came the discovery that made even hardened investigators pause. A folded sheet of paper, stained and fragile, but still readable. It was a recruitment letter from the University of Nebraska, the kind Marcus had carried in his wallet with pride. Finally, under the sifted earth, dental remains surfaced. They were sent to Dr. James Patterson, the small-town dentist who had cared for Marcus since childhood. The match was exact. After 26 years of searching, Marcus Thompson had been found. Margaret Walsh, Diana's sister, received the call on a crisp October morning. She was 73 years old, her voice trembling as she listened to the words she had waited decades to hear. Her nephew had been identified. Relief and rage collided in her chest. Relief that the endless not knowing had finally ended. Rage that Marcus's life had been stolen not by a predator stalking victims, but by panic, selfishness, and silence. For the people of Millfield, the discovery closed one question but opened another. How could a boy with so much promise have his life erased so quickly, and his memory buried beneath soil and lies for more than 2 decades? The answer to that question would come as Brennan faced charges that could finally place him before the law, but never return what was lost. The confirmation of Marcus's remains gave law enforcement the ground they needed to move forward. Timothy. Brennan was charged with accessory to manslaughter and failure to report a death, crimes that carried weight even after so many years. Extradition from Colorado to Nebraska moved slowly, tangled in paperwork and hearings, but the process pressed on. For the first time in decades, Brennan's name would appear not as another shadow in the background, but as a man facing justice in a courtroom. In Millfield, the news spread quickly, reaching every church pew, every diner counter, and every farm gate. The town that had carried silence for so long now faced the difficult task of holding both grief and closure in the same breath. The Methodist Church organized a memorial service for Marcus. It was not a funeral in the traditional sense. It was a gathering that had waited 26 years to say goodbye. The sanctuary filled until people stood along the walls. Farmers in worn boots, teachers who had once marked his homework, classmates who had long since grown into middle age. All came to remember the boy who never returned from the fair. Photographs lined the front, trophies polished and placed beside them, reminders of what he had been and what he never had the chance to become. Sarah Walsh, now Dr. Sarah Gonzalez, returned from Colorado with her husband and 3 children. She stood at the graveside, tears falling as she tried to explain to her young ones why their mother was crying for a boy they had never met. She whispered her farewell to Marcus, words carried not just by grief but by love that had remained unchanged by time. It was the goodbye she had been denied for so many years. Sheriff Kyle Morrison stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, his mind circling back to timing and chance. If the construction project had not been delayed, Diana might have lived long, enough to know the truth. If Brennan had spoken years earlier, the family might have found peace sooner. If Hoffman had made one different choice that night, Marcus might have survived. The cruel arithmetic of what-ifs weighed on Morrison heavily. In the weeks that followed, investigators from neighboring states contacted Millfield. They wanted to know if Brennan or Hoffman might be tied to disappearances near other fairs where Midwest amusements had traveled. The possibility widened the scope, suggesting Marcus's story might not be the only secret buried beneath carnival lights. For Millfield, the case was officially closing, but the scars it left on the town would never fully fade. The story of Marcus Thompson, however, was not finished because the way justice arrived after so many years carried its own lesson about truth, chance, and the secrets small towns keep. The case of Marcus Thompson finally reached its ending, though it was not the kind of ending that brought peace in full. Legally, the discovery of his remains and the charges against Timothy Brennan gave closure. The files could be stamped complete, the reward fund could be settled, the official record could state that the mystery was solved. But for the people who loved Marcus, it felt like a resolution that was both enough and not nearly enough. Marcus did not die at the hands of a calculated predator. He did not vanish into some elaborate conspiracy. His life ended because of ordinary men making extraordinary mistakes. A drunken ride operator acting out of paranoia, a frightened teenager choosing silence over responsibility. 2 human beings who could have saved him with a single call for help, but instead buried him under dirt and secrecy. That was what had stolen Marcus from Millfield. Not fate, not chance, but choices. And yet, after 26 years of silence, it was not confessions or clever detective work that unlocked the truth. It was a bicycle, a twisted frame corroded by time, hidden beneath Nebraska soil, waiting for the moment when an excavator's bucket scraped against it. The same object Hoffman tried to destroy became the very thing that exposed the secret. That rusted bicycle carried the story Marcus could no longer tell. For Millfield, the fairgrounds will never feel the same again. Each September, when lights, glow, and music plays, there will always be a pause, a glance toward the spot where Marcus once promised Sarah he would be right back. For his family, for Sarah, for friends who grew old while Marcus stayed 17 in memory, the story is both complete and forever unfinished. Sometimes justice does not come through speed or strength. Sometimes it comes through patience, through the stubborn persistence of time itself. And sometimes it comes too late for the people who prayed longest to see it. If you are still watching this story, it means it touched you. It means this story deserves your like and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Please help me complete the target of 5,000 likes on this story, a number set by my mother for you, and it costs nothing. Tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story, and let us talk together about how communities can protect their young people and what other secrets might still lie buried, waiting to be uncovered.